Hello class, this is Mr. Turner, and today we'll be looking at a short screencast on the Articles of the Constitution. Now this screencast deals with a little bit more than just the Articles of the Constitution. Really it deals with the parts of the Constitution. And there's a few different parts, a couple parts that aren't mentioned or don't have an article, but are also very important. So the first part of the Constitution is what's called the preamble. So two questions you have to ask yourself: what is the preamble? Or the first question you have to ask yourself, I guess, is what is the preamble? So the preamble is something that we've talked about by now in class. So this PowerPoint, this screencast, will not go into depth on the preamble itself because I'm really trying to be quick here. But the preamble itself, or a preamble, is really an introduction. So the preamble to the Constitution is the introduction to the Constitution. Well, you may ask yourself, well, what does the preamble tell us? Well, this preamble, the preamble to the Constitution, tells us the six purposes of government, or the six purposes, really, of our government. So even though we're not going to go into detail here, it is worth noting again that the preamble is the introduction to the Constitution, and what it does is tells us the six purposes of our government. The other 7 parts of the Constitution are the different articles. Each one of the articles has a different topic. The first 3 articles are dedicated to our branches of government. So hopefully by now, where you are in school, you know that that our government has 3 different branches, each one with a different job. Well, the first article deals with outlining the powers and privileges of the legislative branch. The legislative branch is the branch that makes laws. So it tells us how Congress goes about making laws. It tells us other things like what Congress can do, what Congress can't do. It tells us that only Congress may declare war. It tells us that Congress may appropriate funds. In other words, Congress may tax and use that money. And lastly, it talks about something called the Necessary and Proper Clause. The Necessary and Proper Clause is a very important part of Article 1, maybe the most important part of Article 1. And it tells us that the legislative branch may make any law that it sees as necessary and proper to carry out its duties. Another name for the Necessary and Proper Clause is the Elastic Clause. Not only may Congress make any law that they see necessary, the Elastic Clause, or the Necessary and Proper Clause, also gives Congress the authority and the ability to kind of stretch the laws some and make them fit situations that maybe they weren't originally designed to fit. Because if you read the Constitution as a very literal document, word for word, then it may become outdated very quickly. The thing about our Constitution is that it's lasted us since it was written, almost 250 years ago. And the reason that is because the Necessary and Proper Clause is one of the ways that the Constitution is allowed to change and stretch its powers and abilities. So without that Necessary and Proper Clause, and without the amendment process, which we'll talk about later on, the Constitution would not be near as effective as it is, or as it has been for the last 250 years. Secondly, the second article talks about the executive branch. So it outlines the powers and privileges of the executive branch. It tells you what the executive branch can do, what it can't do. Again, by now, hopefully you are aware that the executive branch is responsible for enforcing the laws. So it tells us it tells us how the executive branch enforces the laws, things it can't do, things it can't do. And then the other part of the article, of Article 2, is it tells us kind of who is involved in that branch. And really, the most noteworthy person involved in the executive branch is the president, and he is the head of the executive branch. It also talks a little bit about the vice president, but really the second article is dedicated to the president and how the executive branch works, what it can do and what it can't do. Article 3 outlines the powers and privileges of the last branch of government, the judicial branch. The judicial branch interprets the laws. That means that it looks at the laws and tells really what they mean. The third article sets up the Supreme Court and gives Congress the authority to make other courts. So what that means is the only court that you'll read about in the actual Constitution itself is the Supreme Court. The other courts that we'll talk about later on were made a little bit further down the road. So really Article 3 only talks about the Supreme Court because when the Constitution was written, it was the only court that existed. Article 4 deals with state relations, or in other words, relationships between the states. So how does one state deal with another state? And there have to be some rules and regulations to prevent states from, if you want to say, trying to take advantage of each other, because each state is going to look out for what's best for that state. So without some regulations as to how these states deal with each other, there will be a lot of arguing and fighting between the states. Another part of Article 4 that's worth talking about is the full faith and credit clause. And what that says is that states have to honor judicial proceedings and records from other states. So for example, we live in Georgia. Whenever you turn 16 or 17, chances are you'll get a driver's license. So when you drive in Georgia, that driver's license is good. Also, when you cross into South Carolina, that driver's license is good, or Florida or Alabama, or any other state for that matter. Those states have to recognize your Georgia driver's license. Now, if you move to a different state, you have to get a new driver's license, but as long as you're living in Georgia, that driver's license is accepted in other states. Your marriage license as well. If you're married in Georgia, when you move to Florida, you don't have to get remarried in Florida. Article 5, we're not going to spend much time talking about. Article 5 deals with the process in amending the Constitution. So we're not going to go into what that process is now, but for the quiz and for the test, you will need to know what Article 5 does, and it simply deals with how the Constitution is amended or changed. Article 6 deals with the Supremacy Clause. The Supremacy Clause is a very important part of the Constitution, maybe even more important than the parts that deal with the individual branches themselves. What the Supremacy Clause says is that the Constitution is the supreme law of the land. I'll say that again. The Constitution is the supreme law of the land. That means that no one, nothing may go against the Constitution. No matter if it's the president, no matter if it's the vice president, the Constitution is the highest law of the land, and nothing may go against it. If something goes against the Constitution, then it's considered unconstitutional. And lastly, Article 7 deals with the ratification process of the Constitution. Remember that the Constitution had to be approved by the states after it was written. So that process was set out in Article 7. It says that 9 out of the 13 states had to approve the Constitution before it would take effect. So real quick before you end this, I know you just heard the bell ringing in the background, so I'm finishing up my planning. What I want you to do before you end this is, somewhere on your note-taking guide, stop and think and answer these 3 questions. To the purpose of the necessary and proper clause, another name for the necessary and proper clause, and what the Supremacy Clause says about the Constitution. Thanks for tuning in, and I look forward to seeing everybody and talking about this in more depth in class.